The second entry of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, using that term remake loosely, is something I've spoken about at length since before the game's initial release last year. I made content about the demo on PS5, which turned me off from purchasing the game for nearly an entire year. I've made content discussing the failure of the game's sales performance, which negatively impacted Square Enix's stock, and how the company publicly admitted to the game underperforming, failing to meet expectations. I've discussed how the PC port also turned out to be a flop, selling less than the previous game and taking well over 1 month just to sell 1 million units. Now Square Enix is in a dire state as the company is currently suffering a negative 8.93% loss in annual revenue. And after their two biggest releases, with Final Fantasy XVI and VII Rebirth greatly underperforming in sales, along with similar underwater performances of their other AAA releases in recent years, the company has publicly announced a reboot of the entire company, set to be completed within 3 years' time. With all the turmoil that's been taking place within this company, one would think that perhaps it's time to right the ship, which the company at least publicly has expressed interest in doing. But how did we get here? While there's many games from this company to point fingers at, the ultimate culprit that I believe has led to the decision of a corporate reboot is none other than Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. A game beloved by many, but in reality is a dire mistake and giant miscalculation from the powers that be at Square. Over 3 months ago, I've played through Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, having completed the game initially in around 40 hours, and subsequently putting in more time that added up to 178 hours before I called it quits. I've completed all regions on the map and have done most of the side content that the game has to offer. My official and final verdict is that this game shouldn't have been made, which is reflective of the game's weak sales performance on both PS5 and PC. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The remake to Final Fantasy VII should have been one game, one release. The critical error that Square Enix made with the entire project was chopping it up into 3 games, so that they could monetize off the profits with each installment. Just with that knowledge alone, it's immediately evident what the initial problems are that the remake was going to have, which has led to the sales disaster that Rebirth is. The first problem is that by making it a trilogy, you see a decline in profits after each installment. Video game sequels tend to sell less than their predecessors in general, mainly because if you've experienced it once, then there's not much reason to keep regurgitating the same idea. It's harder to sell the same thing twice, let alone 3 times, or more, no matter how good the product is. The second problem that Square Enix should have considered in making this a trilogy is the waiting period. You're forcing consumers to wait years between installments before they get to the next one. This very fact directly contributes to declining interest, which further leads to a decrease in sales revenue. The third problem is that they attempted to make this trilogy a PlayStation exclusive, which cuts off other platforms and access to other audiences, which even further leads to a decline in sales performance. And finally, but most important, is the fourth problem, which is that this isn't even a remake, but rather something else entirely. A sequel that's been hidden and marketed to be a remake, which stabs OG fans in the back. It also didn't help that they added a multiverse plot, which ruins the original story, transforming it into some grotesque form that's not Final Fantasy VII, but rather feels more in line with the Kingdom Hearts franchise. This isn't the only company that's tried a multiverse plot for a major gaming franchise either. NetherRealm Studios tried to pull the same nonsense with Mortal Kombat 1, and were rightfully met with backlash from that fanbase. I don't need to explain that falsely marketing a product to be something it's not is a brilliant way to piss off your audience, but I suppose Square Enix missed that memo. But let's get to the game itself. Is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth a good game? The answer depends on your perspective. If you're an adamant diehard of the property, then I'm positive that the answer is yes, but for someone such as myself who is more critical, I must protest that this thing has problems on top of problems. First and foremost is the layout of the game itself. This is an open world game that's more than a decade out of date. The world is filled with acres of empty space that only the most devout of fans will care to venture through. Square Enix's lack of creativity is on full display here thanks to these random towers that have been randomly dispersed in the game world throughout each region. The player needs to unlock the towers to remove the fog on the map, which is something straight out of a Ubisoft game. Ironically, Ubisoft is another gaming company that's suffering financially due to similar creativity and rehash problems, but nonetheless, the game is filled with pointless meandering with a slew of minigames that don't really add anything to the experience and only serve to waste the player's time. What's more, this game has an extreme pacing problem, since Square Enix went overboard and expanded the game far beyond what they needed to deliver a satisfying modern interpretation of Final Fantasy VII's map. Every location with these open world maps are too large and too empty, entirely devoid of meaningful content that's not a repetitive exercise. Like, why is there some random subplot with this Chadley character having you go around and scan shit? Then they copy and pasted this same boring task dozens of times throughout the game. What things like this do is it turns the game into a checklist. This is outdated game design, period. Because Square Enix turned this into an open world game, traversal immediately becomes a dire mechanic. Aside from 2 different regions where you get to pilot a car and a boat, which are irrelevant mechanics considering they only work in one specific location for each, the main way of getting around in this game is by chocobo. The chocobo in this game, however, are frustrating to obtain since the game forces the player to do this stupid capturing minigame that becomes more annoying each time you do it. To make things even more complicated, there are different types of chocobo with different traversal mechanics specific to each region. One type can walk up and down walls, another can glide using pockets of air, a third type can bounce off objects to reach new areas, so on and so forth. While this sounds interesting in concept, in practice this entire idea creates frustrating scenarios where certain areas are literally cut off until you find the exact correct spot on the map to reach where you need to go. And this is just unnecessary in general. They took one simple thing that appears in every Final Fantasy game with the chocobo and have made the experience of using one needlessly complicated. The actual side quests are few in number with each chapter, but none of them are exactly fun. They're designed to force the player to roam around interacting with boring NPCs that tell you to go here and there, usually to collect something valuable only to them. While some side quests give you beneficial rewards for completing them, others just stand to waste your time. The quality with them is too inconsistent. The worst one I played was this side quest where you're in the desert region and you have to go underground to play some stupid Cactuar minigames. Like, what the hell were they thinking? Next, you have the combat system, which is easily the best part of the game, even if it is imperfect. The combat system retains everything that was wrong with it from the first game, but manages to improve upon it thanks to these cooperative attacks known as synergy skills, where 2 characters will build a meter in combat and execute a special attack together. While this mechanic could have been shoehorned into the game, it's clear that the devs took the time to think about how to implement them in a way that creates methods of strategy. This is thanks to a clever addition that the synergy skills have, which will buff the player in specific ways. Some synergy skills will increase the time that an enemy is stunned once you break their stagger meter. Some synergy abilities will give the player a temporary third ATB gauge, allowing you to pull off more commands in quick succession. The best passive effect is the ability to have temporary unlimited magic points, which allows the player to use magic freely without having to worry about burning any magic. These changes make the characters that were weak and disposable in the first game critical for use in Rebirth. Characters such as Aerith and Barret are vital whenever the player is freely able to choose their party thanks to this one mechanic. New abilities such as Aerith's Enduring Wand and Ward Shift make her essential as both an offensive and defensive presence in any combat encounter. Other new overpowered skills such as Barret's bonus round and lifesaver as well as Yuffie's doppelganger turns the game on easy mode. While the combat system is genuinely good, the best skills in the game, which makes it engaging, are locked behind these long-ass skill trees for each playable character, some of which you likely won't unlock in one playthrough without spending over 100 hours in this mess. You, as the player, must also contend with issues that plagued the first game, which include poorly designed boss encounters that are a nightmare on the returning terrible hard mode, which again blocks the use of items, only allowing the player to use magic abilities, including for purposes such as healing. There are numerous area of effect attacks in the game that give the AI way too much range on the battlefield, and too much damage with little time for the player to recuperate, which kills the point of strategy, only effective in making the game a frustrating chore. You have these combat simulations that become increasingly more ridiculous and absurd to the point where they become nearly impossible to complete even for the hardcore experienced players. Narratively, this thing goes off the rails multiple times, choosing to focus on this multiverse plot where in one universe, Zack is alive and pops up at random intervals simply to remind the player that he's still around. The game introduces new scenes that add not a damn thing to the original story and only serve to piss off the original audience that invested time in the 1997 original. And you get a rehashed Sephiroth boss fight at the end in some random location where it's just Aerith and Cloud. Nothing about this makes a lick of sense. It feels as if the devs at Square Enix just put it in here to check a box. Like, we can't go one game in this trilogy without having a generic Sephiroth boss at the end of the game with his one-winged angel theme playing in the background. If you ask me, the shit is kinda getting old. When you look at Rebirth as a whole, objectively the game is overlong for the purpose of cheap fan service. It's too big for its own good. It borrows too much from other games while at the same time serving as an endurance test and frustration. Its side content is weak. It's paced very poorly. And despite that the characters are written appropriately and feel like the cast of Final Fantasy VII, the story they're placed within is ultimately a myriad of bullshit thanks to the unnecessary additions that's been included. When you analyze this game for what it is and recognize the major mistakes that's been made with both it and this remake project as a whole, it becomes a depressing thought to think about what could have been, because it's clear that Square Enix simply didn't understand the assignment. This is a company that doesn't understand its own audience or the popularity of the series itself. You don't make this type of game for something like Final Fantasy. This big-ass, bloated AAA, top-of-the-line graphics that cost tens of millions of dollars to produce, that's overlong and endless in content. The series isn't anywhere near popular enough to make the investment worth it for Square Enix. Now, one could point to Final Fantasy XV as being an example that something like this could work, but on the contrary. Final Fantasy XV is an anomaly in this franchise. This is a game that was built off of 10 years of hype and still failed to fully deliver on its promises despite its success. There were numerous corners that was cut with Final Fantasy XV. Content that should have been in the game that didn't make it into the game, or made it into the game in a half-assed manner. Final Fantasy XV should not be the example set for the future of this series. Instead, Square Enix needs only to look at one game to secure the future of this franchise, and that's Clair Obscur Expedition 33. This game is what the Final Fantasy VII Remake should have been. This is it. Look at it. It looks like Final Fantasy, it plays like Final Fantasy, whereas the actual Final Fantasy games that we have now simply try and fail to cater to an action-heavy audience. In one game, one release, it could have been done in this format. But what we got instead is something that literally screams, "We're trying too hard." Thankfully, Square Enix's investors have taken note of Expedition 33's success, and with the devs from Expedition 33 having recently visited Square Enix to quote-unquote exchange creative ideas, it appears that the company may return to the traditional turn-based format and hopefully complete with an overworld like the one in Expedition 33, like the classic Final Fantasy games of old. But after covering Square Enix for years and experiencing firsthand their continued accomplishment of misunderstanding both their audience, their IPs, and the overall gaming landscape as it currently exists, I wouldn't hold my breath.